Okay, welcome everyone to today's workshop to explain all of the ballot measures that Arizona voters will be deciding this November. Just a quick note, if you have questions, you will have questions as we go along, I'm sure. Please note there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please put your questions there so we can answer those as we go along. Well, without any further ado, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. Lee, why don't you kick us off?
Hi, everybody. I am Lee Marino. I'm a senior research analyst at Morrison Institute up on the 9th floor of UCent. Glad to share my lunch break with you all.
And my name is Alberto Olivas. I'm executive director of the Congressman Ed Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service, part of the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. So we're very happy to partner with Morrison Institute to do a series of workshops all around the community just to help voters understand and navigate what will be a historically long ballot for Arizona voters. Those of you that may be new to Arizona may be very surprised by how we do things here. Arizona is one of a handful of states that allow voters to pass laws directly on the ballot. So in addition to the traditional legislative process where we elect people to make laws on our behalf, voters can also enact legal changes right on the ballot every 2 years. So there's normally a few to several, but this year we'll have 13 very complex issues for voters to decide. So just to kind of set context for how and why that happens, we have ballot measures that appear on the ballot from two sources. And you'll hear them kind of referred interchangeably, but it's important to note the distinction. A referendum is different than an initiative. So a referendum means it's a question being posed to the voters by the legislature. So the state legislature has passed a resolution to put something on the ballot for voters to decide. That sometimes may be because of political issue. They may feel it's more appropriate for the voters to make the final call. It may be a risky or controversial issue that they may, say, let's let the voters be the ultimate arbiter of this issue. Some issues the legislature cannot decide themselves. So, for example, they can't pass a bill to increase their own pay. So you may not know that the last time voters approved a pay raise for state legislators was, I believe, in 1994, so 30 years ago. And I'm sure they would have liked to have an increase in their salary since then, but the legislators can't just vote on that. They have to put it on the ballot for voters to decide, do we want to increase pay for state legislators? And for 30 years, voters have said no on that. The legislators also cannot change the state constitution. So that's really important because the state constitution defines what are the powers of the state government compared to city and town and county governments and other levels of government. So the state constitution defines the powers of government, and it also establishes what laws are legal laws in Arizona. So it tells us what kind of laws we can have and implement and not have and implement. And it's very difficult to change the state constitution. So once voters have passed a ballot measure changing our constitution, it's very, very hard to undo that or to make changes to it. So it's important to know we have 13 ballot measures. Most of those are proposed changes to our state's constitution, which gets me to the numbering system. You'll see things in the 100s, 200s, and 300s. And people may think that's just what order they come in, but there is something to note there. So if it starts with a 1, if it's in the 100s range, that means it is a proposed change to our state's constitution. It's very important to pay attention to those. If it starts with the 2, that means it's a citizen's initiative. So any voter, any registered voter that has an idea for a law or change to the law, if you can get enough other registered voters to agree with you and sign your petition, it'll get on the ballot as a citizen's initiative. It'll be in the 200s. And the 300s are referred by the legislature. So those are legal changes proposed by the legislature for voters to decide. That those will be in the 300s. But in either case, if it's an initiative or a referendum that wants to make a change to our constitution, it'll be in the 100s. So most of what we'll be talking about today are in those 100s. They're proposed state constitutional amendments, and most of them come from the legislature. So I think there's only 2 citizens initiatives that we'll be discussing. The rest are referred by the legislature. The last final note before we get into it is that we ordinarily start at the top of the ballot and work sequentially through them, but because 2 measures on this ballot both deal with the same issue, changes to our primary elections, we're going to start off talking about those, even though they're not in sequence. So we're going to start with 133, and then we're going to skip to 140 because they both talk about our state primary elections. And then we'll go back through and follow the sequence on the rest of the ballot. Lee, did I forget anything before we get into it?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, so without any further ado, let me pull up our slide deck so we can have you follow along as we explain what voters will be deciding. The first ballot measure is Proposition 133. It is referred by the legislature for voters to decide a constitutional amendment that would prohibit any new laws that would go against our current system for holding party primaries. So
you're not on the 133 slide.
Oh, thank you for letting me know that. Is it visible now?
Oh, like resume slideshow at the top there. You're not in like presenter mode.
Okay. How about now?
Mm.
Let me exit that and come back to it.
I feel like sometimes you get, like, this has happened to me, you get stuck in a weird no man's land.
All
right. Becky asked, will the slide deck be sent out to participants? Yes, we could do that. Also, you can go to the Morrison Institute website and it is on there as well.
Okay, how about now? Are you seeing the title slide?
Yep, good to go.
Okay, so also you can scan this QR code and it will take you to the more in-depth explanations prepared by Morrison Institute to walk you through each of the ballot measures. So what we'll be doing is kind of a high strokes yes vote, no vote explanation. But if you want to get into the weeds or a little bit more in-depth analysis, please feel free to access those materials. And we'll show this QR code again at the end. So Prop 133, are we seeing 133 on our screens now? Okay, good. Is a change to our Constitution that would prohibit any new laws that would change the way we hold our primary elections. So just to level set that everyone understands, primaries are the elections we have before the general election, where each political party has a vote for their party members to decide which candidates will represent that party in the general election. So the Democratic Party has a Democratic primary, the Republican Party has a Republican primary, and the voters within those parties will vote and say, we want these candidates to be the Democratic or Republican respective candidates on the ballot in November. Currently in Arizona, independents can vote in state primary elections. And that confuses people because independents can't vote in the presidential preference election that we have every 4 years. It is confusing because the media refers to it as a presidential primary. It's not technically a presidential primary, but without explaining all of that, the state primary elections that we have every 2 years are available for independents to vote. They just have to go through extra steps. So if they're a mail ballot voter, they have to indicate which party's primary ballot they want to have mailed to them. If you go to the polls on election day or you go to an early voting location, then you have to tell the poll worker which ballot to hand you, but you only can vote on one party's ballot or another. You can't do a cross-party or multiple party voting. You have to pick one. So there's a little bit extra work for independents in order to participate in primary elections, but that's how we run primaries. And Prop 133 wants to lock that in place and say, we don't want to mess around with our primary election system. And we're prohibiting any new laws that would alter or change that. So a yes vote means you're in favor of keeping our current primary election system. And a no vote means you want to leave it open that in the future, we could pass laws that would change how we run primaries.
And the one that is kind of contending that we're comparing with is Proposition 140. This is a citizens initiative. They're calling this campaign Make Elections Fair. It makes a lot of changes to how primary elections are conducted. Most importantly, it makes it so that all candidates are placed on the same ballot. So no matter your party, there's going to be Democrats, Republicans, independent candidates, all listed in one ballot. So independents would no longer have to request a specific ballot. We would all have the same ballot in front of us. It would also make it so that currently independent candidates have to receive a much higher number of signatures to get on the ballot than Republicans or Democrats. This would make it so that candidates of all parties have the same signature requirements. It would also make it so that anyone could sign a nominating petition. So when you're, out at the grocery store or the library, someone comes up and asks to get your signature to endorse a candidate to get on the ballot. Right now, you can only sign that if you were in the same party as that person. This would open it up so anybody could do that. It also allows ranked choice voting. So it doesn't require it, but it does open the door if the legislature down the road wanted to go that route, which some states do, which is essentially that if there's 3 candidates, you rank them in order of preference, and then the one with the highest number wins. It also allows the use of public money to conduct a partisan election, like a presidential preference, provided that everybody can vote in it. So if independents could vote in a presidential preference election, then those could be publicly funded and no longer funded by the parties.
Sweet. So those are the 2 kind of competing ballot measures on our state primary system. 133 would keep things the way they are now. 140 would allow for changes so that all the candidates are on one ballot that everyone gets.
We
in
have
addition
a
to the other
question
changes.
here. If both Prop 133 and 140 pass, how would that work?
I'm glad that question came up, and this I think it's come up every time. Yeah,
people in our audiences.
It is possible for competing ballot measures to both be passed by voters, and that has happened in the past. It doesn't happen a lot, but it is possible. So what happens when we have competing initiatives that are both approved by voters is they both technically go into effect as law. And on the specific points where they conflict directly, whichever one has received the most votes will prevail and will be implemented over the other one. So if 140 and 133 both passed, let's say that 133 gets more votes than 140, then 133 would effectively prevent 140 from being implemented. Vice versa, if 140 gets more votes, but they both pass, 140's provisions for putting all the candidates on one ballot for a unified primary that's open to everyone, that would be implemented as well. And a lot of times these things end up in the courts for litigation, and how do we interpret things? But technically they both go into law except where they directly conflict, and in which case the measure that receives more votes is the one that prevails and is enforced. But that's a great question. Okay, so after 133, you will see Proposition 134, which affects how citizens' initiatives get on the ballot. So I mentioned earlier how anyone that has an idea, if you can get enough registered voters to sign your petition, you can get it on the ballot. That's the state now. In order to qualify for the ballot, you have to get so many signatures. Oh, wait, Lee, am I jumping on yours? I am.
You were. I was going to let you take it.
I'll just keep going with it. So it's based on whether you're proposing a change to the Constitution or just a regular law change, or if it's a referendum from the legislature. There's a certain number of signatures you have to gather from registered voters, and there's a formula for that. But it's a percentage of the voters that voted in the previous governor's election. I think it's a little strange. Why don't they just go based on the number of registered voters? But for some reason, it's in the law that it's a percentage of how many people voted in this case for this year. The last time we voted for governor. So all of the people that voted for Kari Lake and all the people that voted for Katie Hobbs added together is the basis for determining this formula. So 134 says, doesn't change the number of signatures you get, but you have to get that percentage in every one of the 30 legislative districts in our state. So our state is carved up into 30 chunks, legislative districts, from which we elect our state legislators, our state representatives and senators. So 134 says, instead of just gathering all your signatures, typically that happens in the big cities. So the Phoenix metro area, Flagstaff, Tucson, maybe Yuma. 134 says you should have to get that percentage of registered voters to sign your petition in all 30 legislative districts in order to qualify for the ballot. So a yes vote means you're in favor of requiring citizens' initiatives to gather signatures in all 30 legislative districts at that same percentage level, and not just get them in the major city centers. A no vote would keep our current system where it doesn't matter where you get the signatures, you just have to get to that certain threshold of a percentage of the statewide voters that voted in the previous governor's election. So arguments in favor of this, all of these have arguments submitted by organizations and individuals. And I encourage you to look at those in the booklet that you, if you're a registered voter, you should have gotten this huge monstrous thing in the mail. The reason it's so big is that anyone can write an argument in favor or against any ballot initiative. And there are many arguments on all of these propositions. But a lot of the arguments for 134 says this would force citizens initiatives to be more responsive to rural and less densely populated parts of our state, and not just attend to the things that people in big cities want. A no vote, the arguments against it say it's already extremely difficult to get a citizens initiative on the ballot, and this would make it much more difficult and a lot less likely that grassroots issues could ever qualify for the ballot. So that's Proposition 134. And Lee, do you want to take the next one, or should we stick with our original sequence?
We can stick with our original.
Okay, so next we have Prop 135, which affects the governor's ability and their powers to declare a state of emergency in our state. So 135 is also referred by the legislature, and it would change our constitution to change the governor's emergency powers during a state of emergency so that it would automatically end after 30 days unless the legislature takes some action. So currently, whenever there's a state an emergency, a disaster, the governor can declare a state of emergency, and the governor decides when that state of emergency is over. But that state of emergency allows the governor extraordinary powers that they don't usually have. It gives them authority to control all state agencies, not just executive branch agencies. It allows them to access federal funds and special funds to address critical situations, and so on and so forth. So Prop 135 says we want the legislature to have some say in whether and when those state of emergencies end. So and if Prop 135 passes, that if you vote yes, you're in favor of changing the Constitution to limit the governor's emergency powers to 30 days unless the legislature votes to extend the state of emergency. The other thing that happens with this is that if they don't vote to extend the state of emergency, it ends at 30 days. The governor can't just declare a new state of emergency unless it's a significantly different emergency that they're responding to. There are exceptions for state of war, for flood or fire emergencies, but other kinds of disasters, emergencies would be affected by Prop 135. A no vote means you want to keep things the way they are now, where the governor's emergency powers don't have an expiration date. And there's not an oversight role for the legislature in that process.
Mm-hmm. And just an editorial note, this is kind of a response to during the initial outbreak of COVID in 2020, when Governor Ducey declared a state of emergency and businesses were closed, and then he was extending when it was closed. Some members of the legislature were unhappy with that use of his power. So this is kind of a response and a check on that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So Proposition 136, it's another election related issue. So currently, if a citizen wants to get an issue on the ballot, they file some papers with the Secretary of State saying, I want to make a change that says that Watts College has to provide cookies to all of their employees every day. And then they can go and start collecting signatures with people who agree with that. If that passed and somebody thought, hey, that seems unconstitutional, that doesn't make sense, then they could initiate a lawsuit after that, after it's passed, after the ink is dried. This makes it so that as soon as I filed paperwork saying we're going to require cookie distribution, before I even get signatures, somebody could file a lawsuit saying that it violated either the US or the state constitution, and then Superior and Supreme Court would have to litigate that before it was even on the ballot. So different, how to say this, the arguments submitted, pros and cons. It would make it really, it's very expensive to get things on the ballot. It's very expensive to gather signatures. It's very expensive to be in litigation. So this could make it really difficult for citizens initiatives to get on the ballot, period. However, it is confusing for voters to have something be passed and then have it gutted later on, which happened with Prop 208 a few years ago. So
I guess one of the key issues with 136 is whether or not you allow constitutionality challenges to a citizens initiative before or after voters have a say. So currently voters get to vote yes or no, and then you would have this challenge to its constitutionality. Prop 136 says we want to be able to keep things from even getting to the ballot if we're successfully able to challenge its constitutionality. So if that works, then voters would never even see it and have the opportunity to vote yes or no. Okay, Prop 137 affects our judicial retention system. So another thing we do differently in Arizona than other states is that we don't have judges run for election. So we have a process by which the state Supreme Court nominates judges and the governor appoints them for their first term. So they are appointed through a vetting process. It's very complex. There's a lot of detail in how that works, but they are appointed by the governor, and then they have a term limit. So after their term is up, which is either 4 years or 6 years, depending on what court system they're in, then they appear on the ballot for voters to decide, do they get to keep their job? So that's why it's called judicial retention, because voters are deciding whether they get to stay in their position as judges or whether they have to go. And so part of why this booklet that voters get every 2 years is so big is that in addition to all the ballot questions, it includes information on all the judges that are up for retention vote. So you can see how they were rated by the Commission on Judicial Performance. So this is a whole commission that takes in a lot of survey data from everyone that interacts with the judge. That includes defendants and plaintiffs in court cases. It includes court employees. It includes attorneys and other judges. A lot of people get to have input on each judge and say things like, does the judge know the law? Are they professional? Do they communicate effectively? And things like that. And so the Commission on Judicial Performance will rate them. And you can see numerically how did they rate? Kind of like grades for students. So voters get to review that information every 2 years for the judges whose terms are up and vote yes or no, or a lot of voters just skip all those judges. That's fine too. But that's the current status. Prop 137 would get rid of that process, and it would end term limits for state Supreme Court and Superior Court judges. And so voters would no longer be voting on whether judges get to keep their jobs. They would just stay in those positions until they reach the mandatory retirement age, which I forget, is it 75?
70.
Right. So they would just stay in their position. There's no vote to keep them in office every time. Well, they wouldn't have a term limit, so there's no 4 years or 6 years. The exception would be when the Commission on Judicial Performance has some concern. And so specifically Prop 137 calls out that would be considered if a judge was convicted of a felony, if they are subject to a, what's it called, a mortgage.
If their mortgage is foreclosed on.
Foreclosed on, that's a foreclosure.
Right.
Or there's other serious concerns about their ethics or their behavior, then the commission might put that judge in front of voters. But otherwise, judges would just stay in their positions, and there's no vote by the voters of the state whether or not to keep them. The other thing to note about Prop 137 is that it's retroactive to this election. So this year, voters will see a number of judges on the ballot, and of note, 2 of them are subject to there's a grassroots movement to vote no to unseat 2 of the judges that you'll see on the ballot this year, related to their vote on a recent court case related to reproductive rights. And so part of the intention here is if Prop 137 passes and voters vote to get rid of those 2 judges, that vote would be moot, that they would still get to stay in their positions. So Prop 137 would get rid of the current system we have where voters get to have a say on whether or not judges keep their positions, and it would be retroactive to this current election. All the judges on the ballot this year, those votes wouldn't count if Prop 137 passes. So a yes vote means you're in favor of ending term limits and retention elections for judges, except when there are concerns by the Judicial Performance Review Commission. A no vote means you want to keep our current system where we do have term limits, and when they're up, voters get to decide on all of those judges.
Prop 138 is kind of a doozy. We between the team that's been analyzing these, we all really had to put our brains together on this one. So Currently in Arizona, the minimum wage is $14.35 an hour, and that has to be adjusted every year for inflation. But if you are a tipped employee, so a server or valet or anything like that, your employer is allowed to pay you up to $3 per hour less. So that would be $11.35 an hour, provided that averaged over the pay period, when you include your tips, you made at least minimum wage for all the hours that you worked. Prop 138 would amend the Constitution so that an employer could pay a tipped employee up to 25% less per hour than the minimum wage. So right now that would be $10.76 per hour, provided that when you add up all your tips and everything, you are making at least $2 over minimum wage. So Alberto has a slide to kind of like show how these numbers shake out, but it is
That's a lot of numbers, and I'm visual, so I had to do this so that I could understand what's at stake. So currently, and I didn't even realize that this is the case now. Employers can right now pay $3 less than minimum wage an hour. So it's $14.35 for minimum wage. Employers can currently pay $11.35 an hour as long as an employee. Oh, my animations. I don't know there we go. As long as your tips added to that lower wage get you to at least the minimum, which is $14.35 or more. So if you make more than that in tips, you would earn more, but the employer's portion would just be $11.35 plus your tips, as long as it gets you to at least $14.35. That's the case right now. So Prop 138 says employers would be able to pay 25% less than minimum wage, which this year currently would be $10.76 an hour, as long as your tips got you to at least minimum wage plus $2 an hour, so $16.35 an hour. So if your tips plus $10.76 get you to $16.35, then your employer would be able to pay you that $10.76 an hour, plus you get to keep your tips. So that's the Proposition 138 schema. And we've been back and forth with students and other people that have experience working in the food industry to see how does that really play out. And it's really difficult to give an average example because, as everyone's been telling us, it depends so much on where you work and how busy it is and what the margins are and how good are you. So if you're working at an upscale seafood restaurant, you might be pulling in a couple $100 in tips. But if you're at Waffle House on a Monday night and you're not very good, maybe you're not making that threshold. So you're just going to be getting minimum wage. So it's hard to generalize an example for this. But one thing that's been pointed out is that because the minimum wage does change over time and goes up over time, that 25% less that employers would be able to pay, that becomes a growing dollar amount. So as the minimum wage goes up, 25% of $15.50 or $16 is more than 25% less than $14.35. So just to keep that in mind, it is complicated. It's a little hard to figure out, but this will affect take-home pay for people that are working in tip jobs. So I think that's a lot of our students. So hopefully students are paying attention and are aware that this is a question that will affect their take-home pay.
Yeah, and it seems like we've seen people in the food service industry arguing for and against this one. So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out for sure.
Okay, Prop 139 is probably the most spicy meatball for the election this year. And it's probably the one that's getting the most attention, but we can't assume people know about this. So part of our job today is to leave you with at least some clear idea of at least 2 or 3 ballot measures that you really care about and that you can really help by raising awareness of. And this one, we don't want to assume people know about it, but it is a big deal. So Prop 139 would change our state's constitution and establish a fundamental constitutional right to abortion in Arizona and protect a person's right to have an abortion up to the point of fetal viability. So Prop 139 defines fetal viability as the point at which an unborn fetus is reasonably likely to survive outside of the uterus as determined by a medical professional. So a yes vote on Prop 139 would establish that constitutional right to abortion in Arizona and allow abortions in our state up to the point of fetal viability. It also would prevent the state from penalizing or prosecuting anyone for assisting someone in obtaining an abortion. A no vote on 139 means you're against making that change, and you want to keep our current laws on abortion in Arizona, which limit abortion access to 15 weeks. I don't see any questions so far. Okay.
Okay, Prop 311 is another referred by the legislature, but it's just a change to state law, not the Constitution. It creates a new state death benefit of $250,000 to the spouse or the children of first responders who are killed in the line of duty due to a criminal act. This would be funded by a new $20 penalty fee on every criminal conviction, not just a conviction of this specific crime, but all crimes across Arizona. This death benefit would be in addition to whatever the surviving family receives from their public safety pension. It would also increase the punishment for committing an assault against a first responder. So it would increase it from, if the perpetrator is aware that their victim is a first responder, it would increase that crime from a Class 5 to a Class 4 felony. And if that first responder ends up dying because of the crime, that would increase to a Class 3 felony. So a yes vote, you support creating the creation of a new state death benefit and increasing the penalty for people who kill someone in the line of duty. No vote would keep the existing benefits, which is just their public service pension.
And I'm not seeing any questions so far, so do feel free to jump in with questions or comments as we go. All right, Prop 312. This proposition is another referred by the legislature. It's just changes regular laws. It's not a constitutional change, but it seeks to provide some relief to property owners that are feeling the effects of damages related to homelessness. So Prop 312 would allow property owners to get a refund on their property taxes in order to reimburse them for repairs and damages caused by unhoused people. And if local government is not enforcing the laws against such behavior. So specifically, this affects cities, towns, and the county in areas that are not incorporated. They would be on the hook for returning property taxes to homeowners and businesses that can document documentable expenses that they're incurring related to these issues. So a yes vote on 312 means you're in favor of a tax refund for property owners to fix damages caused by unhoused people if local officials, meaning city, town, and county officials, are not enforcing the laws against it. A no vote means you're opposed to providing such property tax refunds for repairs, regardless of local government enforcement. And I see that we do have a question.
Yes, so we have a question on 311, if that applies to all first responders or just state level. And it's all, but it's a specific definition. So a first responder is defined as a peace officer, firefighter, fire marshal, fire inspector, EMT, paramedic, tribal police officer, National Guard member, or correctional officer. So statewide, not a specific agency, but those specific jobs.
So that was a question related to the state death benefit for first responders. And 312 was on property tax relief for property owners that are dealing with issues related to unhoused populations. There is a question, is there currently anything in the law related to Prop 312? I'm not aware that there is.
No, there are. We were just talking today, we got a media request kind of related. The part of 312 is that if the Department of Revenue finds that this is a problem, the Department of Revenue would refund you that money that you applied for, and then on the back end, they would withhold those funds, a portion of the state shared funds from whatever city, town, or county was not enforcing these laws. There is some history of that in Arizona, like a handful of years ago when Bisbee passed a ban on plastic bags. The state of Arizona passed something that said that's a matter of statewide concern. And if a local jurisdiction makes a law about that, then they would have some of their state shared revenue withheld as a punishment. But something about this specific issue, nothing comes to mind. Do you, Alberto?
I don't think so, and that's why the legislature decided to take this action, is to provide some way for property owners to get some relief. And this really comes from a lot of the businesses in downtown Phoenix surrounding what used to be called the Human Services Campus. Now it's called the Key Campus. That's a shared location for several agencies that provide services and support for people that are experiencing homelessness, to help them with a lot of critical support services and to transition back into housing and things like that. But the businesses around that area have been complaining for years that the concentration of people in that area has had a lot of impacts on their business and on the property values and things like that. So this is an effort to create a way for those property owners that are affected by these issues to get some financial relief, and frankly, to put some pressure on cities, towns, and the county to take more action, to be more actively involved in addressing those issues and enforcing those laws. Okay, we're nearly at the end. We have three more. So Prop 313, I believe, is this yours, Lee?
That's mine, yeah. So 313 deals with punishments for child sex trafficking. So currently, if a first-time offender is convicted of child sex trafficking and the victim was over 15, they would serve up to 27 years. And if the victim was under 15, they would serve between 27 years and life. This would make a change so that someone who committed this crime, regardless of the age of the victim, would be required to serve life without the possibility of parole. So yes vote is supporting life imprisonment mandated for anyone convicted of sex trafficking, and a no vote keeps the current range of 27 years to life.
Okay, Prop 314 is another very complex measure. This is also referred to the voters by the legislature related to enforcement of the border. So 314 would allow state and local police to arrest non-citizens who cross the border unlawfully. Currently, that is strictly the purview of federal law enforcement. So 314 wants to allow state and local police to also be able to enforce those laws, and also would make selling fentanyl that results in someone's death a Class 2 felony with a mandatory 5-year sentence enhancement. So that's an added 5-year sentence, unless the fentanyl was legally imported or manufactured in the US. So a yes vote means you're in favor of allowing state and local police to arrest people for crossing the border illegally, not just federal agents, and make knowingly selling fentanyl that causes a death to come with the Class 2 felony and an added 5-year sentence increase. A no vote keeps our current laws in place, which there's not a role for state and local law enforcement to enforce the border or deportations, and it keeps our current laws related to fentanyl-related penalties unchanged.
And we got a question here. So this one has a couple laws added into one that may not be related. Yes.
So
there is something called the single subject rule, where both bills in the legislature and anything on the ballot is only allowed to address one issue, so that voters, they might like half of it, but not the other half, and then they're not sure how to vote. This is to kind of avoid that. There have been some things in the past that were taken off the ballot because the Supreme Court decided it violated the single subject rule and addressed too many things at once. For Prop 314, it does feel like two separate subjects to me, but the Supreme Court said that it's fine under the single subject rule and it will be on the ballot as it is.
It's a good question. That's another one that does come up often, because they do seem like separate issues, but in this case, it was able to survive that legal challenge. And the backers say, well, the fentanyl issue is related to trafficking across the border. So they argued that they are connected in that way, but it's for voters to decide whether or not to. You have to vote for all of it or none of it. So it's a yes vote if you want to address both of those things in one law change, or a no vote to keep things the way they are currently. I see there's another question. So then would legal citizens selling fentanyl fall under this as well, or no? So yes. So that part of 314 doesn't distinguish between legal citizens and non-citizens or undocumented immigrants, or anyone that knowingly sells fentanyl to someone that results in them dying would be subject to prosecution under a Class 2 felony with a mandatory 5-year sentence enhancement. The
Unless
distinction
that
here
person
is
got their fentanyl from the US.
right. So the distinction is that illegally trafficked fentanyl that comes from somewhere else versus fentanyl, and it's a weird phrase here, legally imported or manufactured in the US. It sounds strange, like we care less if it's good old American fentanyl, but as someone else pointed out in an earlier workshop, the distinction is that might be fentanyl sourced from prescription fentanyl. So you might have stolen it or gotten a prescription and sold it, things like that. So there's a distinction there, whether it's legally imported or manufactured fentanyl or fentanyl from some other source.
So we just got another question that goes, discusses something that we talked about in a workshop earlier this week. That's kind of a footnote in this law, but is interesting. The question was, does this go against federal law? Has this been challenged or vetted? There is like a little teeny piece at the bottom of the language of Prop 314 that says that Texas is currently passed a law very similar to this, allowing local law enforcement to do border patrol issues. And it is being worked through the federal courts right now. So at the end of this proposition, it says that if the law in Texas is allowed to stand and it can be enforced for at least 60 days, then this one would go into effect. But if the Supreme Court says that Texas law is unconstitutional, then this one would just go off the books, even if Arizona voters passed it. I assume this is a way to kind of avoid that expensive litigation by using Texas as a test balloon, but that's just my interpretation. But yeah, so it hasn't been challenged here, but it is being challenged in Texas, and it's very similar language. So we'll see how it goes.
So basically, if Texas is allowed to do this, then we're going to do this as well.
Back to the question about death benefits for first responders, that is being funded by a new $20 fee onto every criminal conviction. And it's the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, which is like the nonpartisan number runners for the legislature, did an analysis of this. They said based on, there's usually about a 50% collection rate on those criminal conviction fees. That would bring in about $1.4 million a year for the state. And this based on the average number of deaths they have of first responders, that would be about so about $1 million a year. So it would fund itself. And then we have another border question. How will local law enforcement in cities not on the southern border determine probable cause for making arrests of non-citizens who they believe cross the border illegally? Alberto?
That is a really good question. And to my reading, it's not detailed in the proposed text of this referendum. So oftentimes when bills are passed by the legislature or voters pass a ballot measure like all of these, there are issues that aren't defined or worked out in what was passed that have to be decided after the fact. So that actually is a good segue to the final ballot measure on rulemaking, because a lot of times those questions aren't answered. And so they have to be determined sometimes through litigation and lawsuits, but oftentimes just through rulemaking processes. So I suspect that if Prop 314 passes, there will be different approaches to enforcement of it by local law enforcement across the state. And a lot of those are likely to be challenged in courts. So if there's a return to the kind of things that Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County and other sheriffs in other counties were doing, it's likely to end up in litigation as well, to say, is this kind of law enforcement protected by 314? Is it constitutional? Is it racial profiling and things like that? So to my reading, Prop 314 doesn't really address that question, but it's an important question.
So the final one, we made it. It seems kind of in the weeds, but it is important. So as Alberto was saying about rules, a rule is the administrative guidelines for how to implement a law. So the current process is a state agency who receives a law that they need to start a program that gives cookies to all Watts College employees. But they're not given, the law usually doesn't specify like the nuts and bolts of that. And so whatever state agency is involved would propose rules that say, okay, so if you've been working at Watts for over a year, and if you're in the office 4 days a week, whatever it may be, they would figure out the implementation of that and propose rules, which would go to the Administrative Rules Oversight Committee. It has to be, a public meeting. You post the proposed rules, you accept comment. It's a very open, transparent process that you really only pay attention to if you're like a huge government nerd or very involved in being regulated by state agencies, but it is an existing process. It's very transparent. If you ever want to see what the state agencies are up to, you can see it at any time. This one would add some additional oversight. So if a state agency proposed a rule that was going to cost to implement it would cost more than $100,000 over 5 years, then it would have to be approved by the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is housed within the governor's office. And then further, if the rule was estimated to cost over $500,000 over 5 years, it would have to be approved by both that office as well as the state legislature. So the legislature would have to vote to approve implementation of that rule with the higher price tag, and they would have to do it in that legislative session. So if that issue just didn't get onto the committee roster, if they didn't have time for it, it would essentially be a pocket veto and the rule would go away. So typically rules kind of exist in their own little bubble, and this would add both executive branch oversight and legislative branch oversight into this current process. That's just the administrative state right now. That's it, if we don't have any more questions. This URL brings you to the Morrison Institute document that's very detailed. We have like a side-by-side comparison of the two primary election issues. We have a whole timeline on abortion regulations in Arizona, all sorts of stuff if you're into that kind of thing. But thank you guys for joining us on your lunch break just to learn more about the ballot.
And hopefully you'll have identified at least 2 or 3 of these ballot measures that you find especially impactful and relevant to your own life and your own circles. We encourage you just to reach out, use your social media platforms, use your in-person networks with your classmates, coworkers, family and friends, and make sure people understand beyond who's getting elected president, what else is on the ballot that will really matter a whole lot. And more and more every election, and critical votes in our state are decided by tiny numbers of voters. So just getting a few more people to participate that might otherwise not have been paying attention can really mean a drastic difference in our election outcomes. So really do appreciate your time and attention, and hopefully we're leaving you a little more clear on the issues and not muddier. But as always, you can always skip things on the ballot if you just can't make up your mind, or if it's just too difficult for you. Move on and vote on the issues that matter most to you. But do take time to do that work. The deadline to register to vote is this coming Monday, October 7th. So if you need to update your address or if you change your name, make sure you do it by then. And then 2 days later on Wednesday is when the ballots go out for those mail ballot voters. So be watching for that in the mail and take your time, work through it. It's going to be quite lengthy. So you'll have several weeks to work through it and do your research and talk to folks. But we hope this has been informative and gotten you interested and excited. And I think there's a few more things in the Q&A.
Mostly just thank you, which you're welcome. We love sharing this info with you guys. And someone asked, is the recording available to share? I am not sure about that.
We did record this session, and
I don't know where it's going to live.
Right. We could post it on, I know we have a YouTube channel for the Pastor Center. I don't know about Morrison Institute.
I don't think we do.
But
no.
we can share the link with the everyone that registered for this webinar. And I think we'll probably put it on our website as well.
Cool. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lee.